This week on Thinking Deeply About Primary Education, Will Mcloughlin explores the meaning of conceptual understanding.
Conceptual understanding is defined as deeper, comprehensive, and connected knowledge of the abstract ideas in a given domain. And this enables novel thinking, problem solving, or learning.
Explores why conceptual understanding is so important.
And that's just not been replicated, that's just not been measured in the literature. And that is the classic chancellor problem, where this expertise, this incredible thought process, this incredible cognition that makes someone amazing at chess doesn't seem to really help with much else. And when I realised this wasn't actually helping with maths, it was heartbreaking.
And shares his thoughts on how we can support all pupils in developing conceptual understanding in our lessons.
If you have students who can opt out of your thinking throughout the lesson, or the attention's being lost, or the focus being lost, just fix that first. That is the most powerful thing you can do to train conceptual understanding, in my view. And once that's in place, I think then we can talk about the more interesting and the more headline-grabbing stuff, the big-ticket items.
Welcome to Thinking Deeply About Primary Education, the podcast that makes time and space to think about pedagogy, teaching and learning, professional development, anything of interest to time-poor but enthusiasm-rich primary teachers. This week, I'm joined by Will Mcloughlin. Hi, Will. How are you?
There you go. Thank you. How are you?
Yeah, not too bad. Thanks for asking. This week, we're going to focus our attention on conceptual understanding, something I know is really close to your heart. But I thought we'd begin with a little bit about who you are and how you got here today.
Okay, so I'm Will, as you said. I'm a maths teacher in Abu Dhabi, in the Emirates. I've been teaching for about 6 or 7 years, and about 5 years ago, I pursued my master's, and about 2 years ago, I began my EdD, my education doctorate, which is largely on the theme of conceptual understanding, but also a bit about it's a link to animations as well, and how animations develop conceptual understanding. And in line with the themes of this podcast, I've been thinking quite deeply about conceptual understanding for quite a few number of years, and I find it really, really interesting.
Nice. Your research sounds fantastic. And how long do we think we'll have to wait until we can all read it?
I'm hoping within the next 2 years, but let's not be too optimistic.
No, I'm sure. Yeah, I can imagine that it's all hands to the pump for that. But conceptual understanding, I think, is something that we talk about a lot in education. I don't think we've dedicated a specific episode to it on to that bay yet, but it's definitely something that's always there in conversation about maths. So I thought we'd probably begin with definitions. What does conceptual understanding mean to you?
Okay, so a few years ago, one of the first things I did when I started my research was I looked at all the different definitions of conceptual understanding, and there were a lot, and not all of them agree with each other. And long story short, I drew them all together and I came up with my own definition, and it's up there on my wall. I should know it by heart by now, but it says conceptual understanding is defined as deeper, comprehensive, and connected knowledge of the abstract ideas in a given domain, and this enables novel thinking, problem solving, or learning. And that's my definition. I'll just repeat that one because it was a mouthful. Conceptual understanding is defined as deeper, comprehensive, and connected knowledge of the abstract ideas in a given domain, which enables novel thinking, problem solving, and learning.
So, I mean, there's definitely a lot to unpack there, but I think what you've done is you've come up with a really clear sort of guide for teachers when they're thinking about conceptual understanding. And it's almost as if it's like a guide for how we should behave, because, obviously that the mention of learning at the end, it's not almost like an end product. It's something that enables further learning. Is that how you envisage it? Do you see teachers taking this definition and utilizing it? I don't want to jump into the last question where we're going to look at how we can support pupils, but how do you see them using the definition to support them?
Well, there's definitely a lot in the definition. explicitly connecting ideas. That is a big idea of conceptual teaching for conceptual understanding, and so communicating to teachers that the a good way to teach for conceptual understanding is to explicitly discuss the connections between ideas, and to or to draw them together somehow. Um, and you also touched on the idea that the final part of my definition was enables learning, and I think that is worth emphasizing that when we talk about what are the benefits of conceptual understanding, it enables future learning because you have a proper knowledge structure in the head for future learning to build onto and latch onto. And as we know, that's what the research on memory says, is that new memories build on and latch onto old memories, onto prior knowledge. And if that knowledge is strong and coherent and conceptual, then I think you're going to be more successful and you're trying to build more memories on top of that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's almost like feeding into the research into cognitive science and the science of learning, because I can think of different instances where people have described it, perhaps not using the term conceptual understanding, but I'm thinking like Dan Willingham talking about, the concreteness being what you currently know, and obviously the research into schema and things like that there. Why is conceptual understanding important?
So this was the second half of the definition, the idea of it enabling learning or enabling new thinking. Touching that already, the idea that it builds more knowledge structures. I'll go off in another direction for this one though. And another problem we've come across in cognitive science is the transfer problem. And the transfer problem basically says that we found it very difficult, and I'm talking about the field of cognitive science, to see when learning in one domain transfers to a slightly different context. And close transfer, where it's very similar situations, is easy to measure, is easy to find, but far transfer is very rare. I'm a massive chess nerd, so I'll talk about the classic research on chess, and going back to de Groot's work in the 60s, where there was always this suspicion, there's always this idea that chess training developed the whole mind, developed the brain as a whole. And that's just not been replicated. That's just not been measured in the literature. And that is the classic transfer problem, where this expertise, this incredible thought process, this incredible cognition that makes someone amazing at chess doesn't seem to really help with much else. And when I realized this wasn't actually helping with maths, it was heartbreaking because I was trying to recruit kids into my chess club, telling the parents that it's going to really help with the maths. And unfortunately, I can't say that in full honesty anymore. Now I understand that's a bit of a myth. Anyway, transfer problem exists, and I think one of the ways we can combat the transfer problem is that if we teach the conceptual understanding, kids starting to understand the deeper structure of what's going on, they can start to recognize that deep structure in other contexts. And I suspect that is one of the solutions to the transfer problem. But I'm not claiming that with authority there, and I'm not claiming that. And I can't really point to empirical research that has replicated that. It's just my suspicion based upon what I understand of conceptual understanding and the transfer problem.
Just to make sure I've interpreted correctly,
Mm.
the idea that far transfer is very, very difficult, like you say, very, very rare.
Yeah.
But there are times when having a deep conceptual understanding of a domain will allow for transfer within that domain, but not beyond it? Or is there the possibility that you may be able to go beyond it?
Definitely within the domain, it's easier, and conceptual understanding enables it within the domain. And I think there is hope that with a deeper conceptual understanding of the deep structure at play, you can start to use that thinking in other contexts. And so I think there is hope there. I'm not going to change my teaching to go full steam ahead for that. I don't think we're there yet, but I think there's hope, and I think it's something to keep your eye on in the field of cognitive science for the next few years.
That's exciting. I mean, to be honest, we're always talking about best bets, aren't we? And
Yeah.
the fact that
Yes.
the only thing we are certain of is that we're not certain of anything. Like, what sort of areas are you thinking of then when you're thinking about this transfer? Like, so we get really good at mathematical problem solving, and then that applies in a different situation, or what would be like the in the field example that you would use, for your proposition?
Yeah, I just have to talk about spatial reasoning here. Spatial reasoning, to me, is the ability to mentally manipulate shapes in your head, whether it's 2D or 3D. And the classic thing is maybe trying to imagine how a net folds up to be a 3D shape. You've got a coloured net of a cube. Which two colours are going to be touching afterwards? But there's loads of different examples of spatial problems. And there is the most promising area of transfer research is spatial reasoning, because it seems to be a domain general skill, a core cognitive skill that has hope for transfer more widely. That's really exciting because that helps a lot with maths. There's a huge amount of maths curriculum, and I can't think of an exception that can be considered spatially. The other subjects in the curriculum that naturally lead themselves towards this are science, definitely, DT, geography, and I think there's hope for that. The experiments that I'm referring to that seem to measure this quite well is training students with an hour of Tetris practice, and then measuring how good their learning is post Tetris, or how if they can transfer that somewhere else. And Tetris is really powerful training spatial reasoning, because you have to imagine how um, the little brick rotates and then slots down on a different part of the page, and you try to do it rapidly. Um, and the idea is that you can transfer that, or you can then manipulate any shape, any 2D or 3D shape, and use less working memory capacity while you're doing that. While I'm on that one, I'll just give the example of geography, where the classic example that comes to my mind is imagining how a waterfall forms. And that is a complex 3D dynamic situation. And if you can visualize that from the front view, from the side view, from the top view, and you can switch between those instantly, think you have a pretty good idea of how this dynamic, complex situation evolves over time. So that's my hope. That's my hope for spatial transfer. I think that answers your question.
I mean, obviously, you read a lot of education research and stuff. So you'll be aware of things like brain training, and brain training
Yes.
doesn't make you better at stuff. What's the
Yeah.
distinction between these Tetris investigations or studies and that kind of, this brain gym will make your brain faster kind of thing?
Yeah, so absolutely. So brain training is on the false assumption that fast transfer or training executive skills is possible. And it doesn't seem to be. So we have not managed to recognize that. And far better in general is explicit teaching of domain general skills in a knowledge-rich curriculum. And the more you know about a given domain, the better you are. And all the skills in that domain build on largely domain-specific knowledge. So absolutely, this is that is my understanding of cognitive science as a whole. However, the exception is this idea of spatial transfer, and the idea there seems to be that spatial training can be trained, it can be done, and it seems to be a fairly well, I don't know the exact vocabulary the cognitive sciences use. So again, I'm not a spatial cognitive scientist here or anything like that. So I don't want to say anything. So everything to say, treat with caution. But from what I've read, I understand that this is the closest thing to a core cognitive executive kind of thing that can be trained, and that skill, then that skill of just manipulating objects in your head can then be applied in a lot of circumstances, a lot of which are in our curriculum. And I think a lot of teachers from a lot of different disciplines would recognise that being able to process spatial relationships can really help. And so that's my understanding of it right now. I know that Zachary Hawes in the US has done a lot of research on this, and he's looked at some quite stuff. And I will point to his expertise over mine.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And I think it's because, so it sounds like it's because they're focusing specifically on this area. That's where the potential comes from, And I mean, primarily, I want to make sure that listeners knew that you weren't conflating this sort of brain training investigation, that you were well aware.
Absolutely.
because we're a skeptical bunch. It's a topic.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Just to reiterate that, I am not advocating um, general training or get rich quick schemes in education. Get clever quick schemes. I advocate explicit direct instruction of domain specific knowledge in your domain. There is some hope though that there is a spatial training could be embedded in the curriculum in the future, and it could be shown to help more broadly. And there's a lot of codes in that sentence.
So we've established what conceptual means to us at the moment for the purpose of this conversation, why it's important. How can we support pupils in developing conceptual understanding, and particularly in mathematics?
So there's so many things we could do here. And before I start talking about all the sexy stuff, let me just reiterate the good classroom teaching is the number one thing you should be doing. And if you're not doing cold call, if you're not using mini whiteboards, or if you're not doing call response or things like this, or your own variant of it to match your teaching style, if you have students who can opt out of your thinking throughout the lesson, or the attention's being lost, or the focus being lost, just fix that first. That is the most powerful thing you can do to train conceptual understanding, in my view. And once that's in place, I think then we can talk about the more interesting and the more headline grabbing stuff, the big ticket items. The techniques, I would say, worked examples. So lots of worked examples, especially the higher up in I'm talking secondary maths here. We've got worked examples the last two sides of A4. Really think deeply about how you draw attention to the overall thing here, the overall narrative of what's going on. Catcher and Bone in the 90s did some work on the sub-goal learning model. And so once you've done a big worked example, you've talked about it through in a way that holds attention and a way that is engaging in the class and stuff like that. When the time is right and if the attention is still there and the focus is still there, then you highlight specific big sections of your working out. And you say, what was the sub-goal of this bit? Well, the sub-goal of that bit was to find what this missing value was. And then, okay, we've got that bit. Now we've got a big chunk of working out here that can all be grouped together. That's a sub-goal. And then eventually it's all leads together to be a overall goal. And so his research on the sub-goal learning model made a lot of sense to me, that we're thinking metacognitively about what led us to follow that path in our working out. So worked examples, loads to say there, and sub-goal learning model is quite exciting. And with that as well, your self-explanations. Self-explanations of sub-goals could easily lead in together here. The easiest way to implement self-explanations is think best, share in the classroom. However, if you trust your students to be switched on and using their time wisely, you can ask them to say, okay, we're going to stop here. We're going to have 1 minute where you read through it in your own heads, and I want it to make sense to you. And tell them to make sense of it. But that's a bit of a culture issue. Can you really trust them to sit there without zoning out? And I think for some of my classes, I can. I won't try it with the others. I use the word phrase there, sense making, make sense of it. And I think that's a big idea of conceptual understanding. Make it make sense in your own head. Read through it, explain it to yourself. Why did that? Why did we do that? Why was that our first step? What was the point? Then we're talking about variation theory. I really like Craig Barton's work in variation theory. That goes back to Anne Watson's work as well. If you've not seen the classic Craig Barton podcast on variation theory, I really, really implore your listeners to have a check that out. I will throw in ideas about manipulatives and animations. You've done a lot of work on manipulatives, I know that, and you know how to use manipulatives far better than I do. I like animations, and so that's what my research is on. But there's a lot of issues that animations can have, and if you're doing bad animations, then that can interfere. You want animations that are designed with multimedia principles in mind. So May's multimedia principles, it needs to be designed in line with them. And I'll give you one example of that: the transient information effect, where if information disappears from the frame of your animation before it's been processed and held in sufficiently well in long-term memory, then students have to work hard to recall that as they try to process the next frame. And if that previous frame is necessary to process the next frame, then you're going to have an extraneous cognitive flow there that interface with learning. And that's a transient information effect. So if you are using some sort of animation or GeoGebra or virtual manipulative in the classroom, try pretty hard to avoid transient information. And a good way is to have maybe side-by-side windows of the previous, like the maybe the folded up cube and the unfolding net over here. So they can refer this to this over here. Bit of split attention going on there. That's better than split attention in time, where they're referring back to the previous memories there. I would say that kind of thing is a good way to avoid that. And the point of that is to be able to visualize how one dynamically transforms into the other and to form a coherent mental model of how the net and the cuboids morph into each other.
I think that's fantastic. I think because through your examples and through your sort of recommendations, what you've done is you've shown, because like the first thing people are going to like think is, how do we make sure that what we're teaching isn't just procedural, you know? And for worked examples, for variation theory, that's a criticism that gets leveled at them all the time. But actually, through your explanation, I think you've done an excellent job of showing how it's the concept, it's the why, it's like you said, the lovely word narrative that you're focusing
Mhm.
on there. And so I think, yeah, that would have been the first thing I asked, but I don't think we need to. But this the sub goal learning model, how often would you use that
Yeah.
in your classrooms?
Um, it's got a time and a place. It's not a go-to. I think it's necessary when you've got a longer worked example. I think that probably lends itself to your GCSE prep or your A level or IB prep years. Um, I wouldn't use that often. I would use it in yeah. There are times where I would explicitly point out sub goals in Key Stage 3, um, but not as a whole narrative of sub goals. It would be just be drawing attention to this is important. This step is really clever. Why did we do this step? What's really cool from going from there to there, and just focus on one really key idea. But processing a full worked example, that's a when it's a long problem solving question, you're training top sets to be able to answer grade 9 questions in GCSE. I think that's where subgoal really, really comes into play. If you're going to do it as a full process.
Yeah, I think it's really good, and I think it could have lots of application in primary. I'm thinking about mental methods in particular,
Mm,
and for instance, say you were subtracting a number that was close to 10, but not quite 10, so you'd find the bond to 10 with the subtrahend. Then you would subtract 10, then you would add the bond back or whatever, and it's not as sort of meaty as perhaps I'm imagining the sort of secondary school mathematics where there are multiple steps to find a
yeah,
solution. But even then, you're looking at, well, what's the point of this bit? And asking
yeah,
yourself, I think that has a lot of utility. Is that the kind of thing is that how you might imagine
yeah.
it being used in primary?
Absolutely, I absolutely can imagine that. And observing my colleagues in primary, because I work in an international all through school, and so lucky enough to have FS and Year 13 all in the same building, and I can just pop down to primary all the time. And observing my primary colleagues do things like that has been transformative uh, in my career. And I would encourage any secondary teacher to go watch primary. It's such a wonderful experience, and exactly what you're saying, the idea of subtracting 10 is easier than subtracting 8. Um, again, this idea that you're saying it out loud that we prefer subtracting by 10, so let's do that, and then let's do the small jump with the 2. I assume that's how you would do it. But you're saying it out loud. This is why my brain prefers doing it this way versus doing it this way. Um, yeah, because I'm faster and more accurate when I'm dealing with tens. and that sub goal of dealing with the 10 first and then dealing with the small jump is better than one big goal of subtracting 9. Yeah, I love it. That's exactly what I'm advocating.
Nice.
Um, yeah,
And I think it goes back to your definition as well, because the conceptual understanding and number sense, conceptual understanding of the conservation slash composition of number, that's only possible if you understand that numbers can be broken into parts and they won't change and stuff like that there. So, it feeds into your definition. That's making learning possible
yeah.
through prior understanding. With variation theory, what does that look like in your, I suppose maybe start with planning and then look at the classroom. Is it like the Craig Barton minimally different examples approach, and how do you fit that into your planning schedule?
Okay. Very interesting question. Um, I'm not a superstar teacher like Barton. So I'm not a superstar practitioner like Barton. I'm just someone who's trying to implement good ideas in my classroom. And I'll tell you how I do it. But if someone wants to see a pro do it, go ask Barton. Um, but yes, um, I love my multiple methods. I love showing um, two different methods to solve the same problem and compare and contrast. There are actually surprising number of similarities between that method and that method. And sometimes it's not a completely different method. Sometimes it's the same methods, but I'll just take a different shortcut on both sides. And the comparing side to side, that's really interesting. Um, that's one way. I made some really nice PowerPoints in the past where I've done full worked example on this side, full worked example on this side, and highlighted specific stuff to them. Um, do it. So that's my animations going to play that I really like. Then there's question order structure. So Craig's variation theory, .com website. And there's some really, really clever question sets on there. And I've really enjoyed implementing doing that with my year 7 and 8 classes this year. Um, and there's some really interesting discussions that happen when kids start to notice from one line to another um, how the numbers slightly change and the mean the answer slightly changes. I say mean because I was doing averages this week with the year sevens, um, and the key idea is the first time they'll do it, they'll just work out the answer each time using the algorithm. You have to get them to stop that. You have to pester them and say, "I love that you're going so quick. The algorithm it's really nice. However, today we're going a bit slower." And we're going to guess it first, and then we're going to do it. We're going to guess it first, and then we're going to do it because we're trying to guess how this subtle change in the question leads to a subtle change in the answer, or maybe no change. And to kick this off, I might just say, okay, so all we were doing. So I'm sticking to the example of means. All the numbers in this list have doubled. So from this list to this list, they're twice as big. Look at it. This one has turned into a two. This three has turned into a six. Okay. Now I would think, is the mean going to go up, down, or stay the same? And that's how we start. So we just get in it, and it's so obvious. All of them are going to say up because it's doubled. It's going to double. But we're starting off by just and slowing them down deliberately so that they do get in the habit of guessing. And that's how I build up the culture of making the most of variation theory. Um, and I might be 5% of what Barton is because he's wrote a massive book on that. But I think that's a really good way of doing deliberate practice with that variation theory. So there's some really nice IB questions. There's a website I use called Christos Nicolaides, and any IB teachers would know this website. And there's question sets on there that look just horrendous. Like they are the most disgusting Einsteinian equation stuff you can imagine. You can imagine Einstein's chalkboards kind of stuff. But like once you get used to it, it's not so bad. So you get the idea, and it's fairly accessible once you practice the topic. And you've got four or so A, B, C, or D questions in the thing, and we were doing it with the class, and the class just found it hilarious that each one just ended up being the exact same question when you just manipulated the algebra a little bit, and the answer was always x equals 2. no matter how ridiculous it was. And it was they all looked completely different, but then just with the obvious algebraic steps, you realised that each one just suddenly morphed into the first one. And it was classic variation theory. And I don't know if Christos Nicolaides, the guy who made this, was deliberate about this, but he did some very clever question design to create those question sets. And I really enjoy that because the energy in the class is they find it just ridiculous and hilarious that, it's just the same one all over again, sir. Um, and yeah, it was a really nice thing. But underneath the hood, what they were thinking of is some of the deep structure behind the equations. And they were cutting on to the fact that um, these things that looked really impossible and really crazy and uh, really inaccessible, um, quite easily with some easy algebraic manipulations, just break down into a simple one that you've solved already. And I think that's a form of variation theory, which I really, really, really enjoyed teaching this week.
I mean, that sounds amazing. I mean, I think you should stop putting yourself down. It's, I mean, it sounds like your kids get a really good deal if they're getting the opportunity to think in all these different ways.
Yeah.
I think no such thing as superstar teachers, but if you're thinking deeply about your practice, if you're giving pupils the chance to go through those journeys, I mean, it sounds like there's no way he could have possibly done that by accident. He's doing that thing where you're subverting expectations. Don't know if
Yes.
you've come across the Mason and Watson paper about non-Euclidean
Yeah.
geometry. I think it was 2006.
Oh, I don't think I have. I've definitely read one of their papers, but it was a long time ago.
So this
I should absolutely read that again.
this one's a favorite of mine. I think it was they were testing out quite sort of the question sequencing with teachers, and the teachers all thought they were following, using this equation to plot a straight line, but then it turned out to be a non-Euclidean circle. Once and it was like, wow, what's going on here?
Oh,
So that sounds like that's what he's doing. Because your kids have had the same reaction to the
wow.
what's going on here. Yes, I mean, that was recent because they were almost like telling a story, and there was like a big twist at the end kind of thing. Yeah, so it sounds like he was intended to do the same thing. The last thing I'd like to ask you about is the movement and the animation, because I'm a big fan of the role of movement, certainly in manipulating arithmetic structure, and how sometimes the contextual distinction is purely movement based. What sort of thinking are you doing? And will we find examples on your website? Is that sort of the things you've been developing as you've been testing this stuff out?
Yeah, yes. So the interest in this developed from lockdown 5 years ago, and suddenly did a hobby, and I've always thought about having a YouTube channel and things like that, and I ended up having to play with PowerPoint, and I just somehow got really good at animating on PowerPoint. That was 5 years ago, and the early stuff was shambolic, but the later stuff, as I got thought more and more about what it should look like. There's some really good, in my view, animations on there that make it far easier to process the maths involved. And so a classic one is how in algebra solving an algebra from one line to the other, um, on advanced the website, this line morphs into this line, and everything that's the same stays exactly the same, and everything that is a manipulation or simplification or expanding brackets or factorizing, whatever. I've tried to make it as smooth as possible so that you can see exactly which bits are moving and which parts are staying the same. And I think it helps the students follow along with what's going on here and where how one thing is moving into another. It's I would describe it as attention and guiding attention. And there's a lot of research out there about how you do guide attention. And the similarity principle is one of them, where the things you want to stay the same, you keep the same, and only the things you want them to look at are the things that move. So that's one of them. Another thing I will point to is on that idea of attention is if something is you only want the salient information on screen that that you need, you you don't want to fall into transient information traps where important ideas that should be present for them to process need to be held in working memory. But you want the minimum amount of information on the screen possible to avoid transient information. And to do that, you might want to blur the background. Interesting stuff pops forward, the other stuff pops backwards. And that's probably better than it going off screen because you don't lose the context of where you're up to. Attention queuing stuff is really good. And all of these ideas can be used in the classroom with a teacher covering up things that they don't need to think about right now. Transformations in maths. A lot of maths can be described in terms of transformations and how one thing transforms into another. And if that transformation is smooth, fluid, animated from one frame to another, I think you get a deeper understanding of what's going on. Because if you think about the epistemology of maths, maths is continuous. It is we can think of a lot of maths in terms of transformations, and if that's how it is presented, as opposed to static diagrams in the textbook, I think there is some advantage to that. There is also some advantage to static diagrams in textbooks. Namely, probably number one is that it avoids transient information. The final one that's coming to mind, again, I'm just Mayer's multimedia principles are one of the main ones, and are one of the main sources of literature for this. Your split attention effect. You want your labels, your numbers, or whatever it is, integrated into the image, into the diagram, and those can fade out in size and come up, and the prevalence of it can fade into the background. The font color can become a bit fainter when you don't quite need it right now, and you want to guide attention to specific parts. I think it's easy to do integrated labels in diagrams with animation, just because it's presented nicer for the eye to process than static diagrams, because it just gets a bit cluttered on the static page. But anyway, that's my suspicion. That's well, I think there's a lot of research to say that that's all promising, and I'm trying to implement a lot of that into my current research, and I'm gonna later this year I'm gonna try and roll that out and see if it can detect that this way of learning, this animated way of learning, has advantage for conceptual processing than more traditional methods. Traditional methods that I also massively value.
So you've got a fantastic piece of wordplay. So it's add advanced, and is it maths.com or mathematics.com?
Advancemath.com. So two D's in ads, Vance, no D, Vance, no D, maths.com. Yeah, so this is just my hobby. This is my website. I put all my resources on there. And it's mainly for the kids, but there's also some professional development stuff on there. And there's also some resources for teachers on there as well. And the headline feature is the YouTube videos that are all animated words examples and brief introductions to GCSE, A-level, and IB maths topics. Yeah, it's just my hobby. And it's completely free, and it will make my day if I saw a few more teachers log in, go on that link today, and use some of the resources.
Yeah, this is going to be really, really useful for teachers who are thinking about their maths practice in particular. I mean, I think it may extend beyond to mathematics, but certainly for mathematics, it could be really, really useful. And I think your classroom sounds like a wonderful place to be as a student. I mean, maybe try and see if I can come and spend some time in your class just to enjoy the deep thinking that's going on in it next time I'm over.
Lovely. Yes, the door's open.
All that's left to do is say thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
And everyone at home, until next time, thanks for listening. This week on Thinking Deeply About Primary Mathematics, nope, that's wrong.